What's up guys, my name is Fari, and in today's video I'm going to be going through a custom academy platform that we're actively integrating. So I'm going to be showing you how I'm thinking about things and how we're also implementing Killer Chaos OS in terms of our thinking and also decisions behind how we're actively building this out, and also showing you and telling you basically what the use cases for the specific build are. So first things first, the main mission or the main overarching context for this specific build is that they run a specialized service where they basically do implants, and the main key function for this specific academy build is ultimately to have users interact with the platform and also for them to collect payments to the live events that they're ultimately going to be having. So basically streamlining the entire process. So you may ask, what is basically comes out of this specific build. It's ultimately us taking control over the entire design aspect. And I know one of the main questions would be, why are we taking control over the entire design aspect? And that's simply because we need to have as much control as possible in terms of what we're building out. So for example, what we're going to be integrating is specific to the business that we're working with. So ultimately we have to make sure that we're taking full control, because with more control then we can ultimately tweak things as and when needed, which I will get into once we just run through this quick overview of the design. So we have full control over the entire design aspect, which ultimately gives us flexibility in terms of us making changes and also just updating the CMS that we've custom built for them as well. This is super important. I've redacted a lot of information, so that's why it kind of looks like this, because I've just kept specific the logos and stuff like that pertain to what we're building away, so it's kind of hidden. So essentially what we have is we have a landing page. So this is the main form of contact where we can also just run Facebook ads. So the main requirement for this is they're going to be running paid traffic. So through this paid traffic they're also going to need just Google tags, and for us building this custom, it also gives us the flexibility as well to basically have control over that, so that we can also just help them track in terms of the how much they're spending on ads, where the clicks are as well. So if we need to make specific changes to buttons and all of that, we have control over that. So specifically this is the landing page where we ultimately have the customers or the people that are enrolling into these courses basically land. So you can see your upcoming courses and all of that in effect. So the specific use case for this is being a first point of contact. Ultimately we need to make sure that we're building it out in a way that feels premium and also established and builds trust as well. So that's why we've got so many trust indicators specifically for the next courses, so that this also builds trust to show clients or people that are wanting to enroll into this specific platform, that they know that we're hosting events, which is also important because that also builds trust as well. Because if you can see what are the trust indicators, for example, you're hosting events, live events, and people are joining these events, that ultimately gives more trust and credibility as well, because the main thing is ultimately showing what it is that they're actively doing in terms of the service that they're providing, so that people have a seamless integration into the platform. And what I mean by this is that they simply understand what is going on from the get-go, which is ultimately important. And that's why we have these three trust indicators, which are develop your implantology proficiency and earn an accredited certificate, and also gain knowledge into renowned lecturers. So one of the things that we're going to get into right now, which is basically the lectures. So they're ultimately going to have lectures as well. So these lectures are going to be rotating per event. So we also need to solve for that, in the sense that we need to build it in a way that we can constantly just change the lectures that are ultimately going to be on the roster for this specific implantology course, and also making sure that we're just basically building it in a way that also builds trust as well, because this is a higher end service. So we need to make sure that we're catering specific to the needs of our clients. So I'm not going to dive too deep in terms of the design and why we did certain things. I think that, is not as important as the specific use case and the outcome for our specific client. So this ultimately, now we can jump into the main key functions for this. This is ultimately the lectures page, where we ultimately have the lectures, what they do, and also a bit of bio in terms of what they're doing. I think this also just builds trust in making sure that, the people that are, enrolled this, we're showing that these are industry leading people that are going to be lecturing or teaching these courses, which is ultimately going to build trust as well. So ultimately, what is going to happen in terms of how we're thinking through this specific build is that we're ultimately going to have it, as a platform where users ultimately are able to log in. Then from them being able to log in, then they can have access to certain materials. So some are going to be paid, some are not going to be paid, so we're going to have to also just solve for that. Through the paid ones, they are ultimately gonna, we're going to have to restrict access, so they're going to have to pay to get access. But if it's for free, that ultimately covers the free case studies that they do have, because one of the main things is that they're gonna have case studies, and these case studies are gonna be specific to the people that are enrolled in terms of this platform. So making sure that we're also just making sure that we're solving for that is also super important, and also just focusing on building as much trust as we possibly can. So I'm not going to run over this too much, because I don't think that is where the secret sauce is. I think the secret sauce is in these contact forms, and also the backend that I'm going to be showing you just now. So specifically, when we go to the course registration, so these are basically lead intake forms. They're custom built, so we have flexibility in terms of making sure that we can change things as we need. So these specific lead forms will be run onto the platform, and then we can set up a webhook that ultimately captures these lead intakes, and then we can set an automation, for example, that ultimately sends them through Slack. So if they're using Slack, we can basically just get them a notification that ultimately says, hey, a new person has registered onto this specific course. So that is how we're actively thinking about this, and then also making sure that we're populating and running automations on this specific lead intake form in a manner that we can also just capture the details as well on the database. So this database doesn't have to be specifically tied to any specific database. You can use Retool, or you can even use Airtable, which I like. So you can basically have a lead or someone that is interested in these specific service and wants to join the Implantology Academy. So we can just have a lead intake form that automatically just sends these their information over to the database, and then from that database we can have another automation that just sends to Slack to say, hey, there's someone that has ultimately registered for this specific course, or has made an inquiry, and through that we ultimately are then able to capture it, then run email sequences if we need to. That ultimately increases retention, because then we can make sure that they're generating cash flow from that, because we're not constantly manually having to have the administrator to basically send out the emails manually, which takes a lot of time. So they basically have this system where they are getting the lead intake forms from people filling in the forms, and then through that they're being notified that, hey, this person has signed up, and then automatically an email gets sent to the specific user to say, hey, thank you for registering. We have 1 to 3 options in terms of what is the next step, ultimately providing that next step for them, so that there's no ambiguity, which is ultimately a key thing that we're also solving for, and making sure that we're making this as seamless as possible. But also through this is now where the fun part comes in, where I see a ton of value that we can expand a lot more on, and this comes solely down to the back end. So this is the functional part. If we look to the left and everything I've explained, that's the more functional part, where no one actually sees what is going on the back. But then now we get into the source, where we ultimately have the powerhouse for the entire platform. So this is where we have more control and flexibility on, where we have a login registration, and through this login registration we then get prompted in terms of showing the admin portal where they can see. So for this specific one, this is the specific one for the landing page for the practice. So we want to possibly expand a lot more on this and make sure that we're building this out with specific dashboard metrics, and also making sure that we are connecting different automations that are specific to the business's use cases on this. So specifically, making sure that emails are getting sent out, that we also have metrics in terms of how many emails are being sent out, and that is all consolidated into one specific dashboard. Because in as much as we can have a third-party plugin that can ultimately pull this in, we need to also make sure that we're taking the specific use cases and what the client's needs are, so that we also are making sure that we're making it as custom as possible. Because through this custom mode approach, we're then able to provide and give that flexibility to them, because their business is ultimately unique, and through this uniqueness for their business, that ultimately means that we are then able to give them a competitive edge. Because if we need to change something that they need, they ultimately have a system that is more powerful for them and is super tailored to them, rather than another practice or in another academy that is using off-the-shelf tools that ultimately does not give them a competitive advantage. Because I solely believe that you get more competitive advantage the more flexibility and the more customization you do have. 100% it takes a lot longer, but ultimately this is the mode that I see a lot of businesses taking, in terms of the ones that actively build a lot of leverage. And then the question for us ultimately becomes, how can we create as much leverage in this V1, in the sense that we're making sure that we're building as much as we possibly can, but also making sure that we're creating as much leverage as possible as well. And I think through this, we're then able to understand what are the leverage points, because simply through having this specific admin dashboard, which is still in a V1 phase, we can then have them ultimately add different functions to the CMS. So basically add new photos, make custom changes, and all of that effect. But then when we scale it up in terms of when we now integrate this specific platform where users get to log in, we then have everything consolidated into one, in the sense that we have all the students in one, and then we can just simply just send them an email to say, hey, this is the course that we're having in the next 2-3 months, and also making sure that we're providing them an experience that ultimately is super tailored to them. Because the more tailored the experience is, the more keen that retention is going to increase. But ultimately understanding that through this V1, there's still a very, very long way. Things may change, things may change in terms of how we're going to be building this out, but solely just building this competitive advantage moat is what we're thinking about this, and also implementing in terms of trying to create as much leverage as possible. So with this build, we may go far or we may not go far, but ultimately we're just going to make sure that we're thinking through specific builds in this manner, in the way that we want to create as much leverage as we possibly can, but also make sure that we're reducing complexity in terms of the steps that we're following. So for example, with this specific admin dashboard, we want to make it as seamless as possible, so that it ultimately acts as an infrastructure layer to their business, so that they don't need to manually just chase leads, or they don't manually have to chase clients or any of that effect. That they have one consolidated dashboard that they can update the content that is hidden and also not hidden for the people that are onto the platform for this specific academy, and then also make sure that also integrates into their main platform as well. So this ultimately focuses on solving the problem of scalability, because now we have control over this, so they can scale if they want to. Say if they have 50 plus students they're paying, we have a means for which we capture their payment information and also store that in case they want to make sure that they pay again, and also creating that LTV as well, which is also super important, because then the more we can keep people coming to the events, then we can just expand on that. So yeah, so this is how I'm basically thinking about this in a nutshell. I wish I could share a lot more. This build is super fun, super exciting to to think about. Yeah, I'm still kind of trying to figure out how best to show these builds as much as possible, and also just make sure that I'm getting a lot better in terms of communicating what it is that we're building. Just making sure that, you know, I'm learning as much. Please bear with me. Like I say, like, I'm trying out a new format, and doing this every single day is something that I'm getting to grips with, so that I just build that personal building each and every single day mode, and also making sure that we're actively showing what we're building on a day to day, because that is ultimately going to lead us to, you know, getting to the grand vision of Killer Chaos OS. So yeah, if you guys want to make sure, or if you guys want to see another video in terms of how this, you know, progressively progresses, please make sure to also just let me know in the comments, and then I will definitely go through this again, and also just give you an update as well in terms of how it is going, and how we're actively implementing certain things in terms of the design builds and the use case for it, and how it ultimately is, you know, working in terms of, you know, our specific client. So yeah, we may change a lot of things, we may go pretty far as well, we may not go as far, but ultimately we need to make sure that we're just focusing on this build and making sure that it is as seamless as possible. So if you guys enjoyed this video, make sure to connect with me on the X, LinkedIn, Instagram, and I will see you guys in the next video.